Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for that wonderful presentation, and particularly that very high-tech hearing from the authors themselves and from the people that are out there in the field doing this type of work. I think that's a great way of communication. In fact, I think congratulations to Jeff and Aiken for what is, I think, really a pioneering effort here in bringing together for the first time a set of real case studies of application of choice models on the ground in developing countries. I think that's really a landmark achievement. I was particularly impressed because I started my work as a graduate student, which is a long time ago, I must admit. But the first thing I was asked to do was to go out to estimate farmers' utility function in terms of the risk-income trade-off. And sit down. And I guess that was really the very early days of what was a very crude type of choice model of trying to get these types of trade-offs and stated preferences of farmers in that case. And then went on from that work and started to think conceptually about how this could be used in environmental services. And in fact, my first published article was on option value. And how you might estimate that. But that was all very conceptual. Here we are now, we have a whole set of examples from the field, from developing countries, on how this can be done. Let me just make a few comments much more from the point of view of a broader decision-making context in which these tools and choice models could be used. And I'm going to focus on the environmental side, and recognizing that choice models can be used for a number of different applications. And in fact, in the case studies we've heard, some of them are related very much to trade-offs in food preferences and food safety. They can be used for private goods as well as public goods. So, but from my point of view, from an environmental side, and that's what I've been working on recently. In fact, my next meeting is on an issue related to the relationship between agricultural expansion and deforestation, and particularly oil palm expansion in developing countries. And my first point is that even though in my previous employer we always talked about win-win outcomes, or even when I left we were starting to talk about win-win-win, most of the time we're talking about trade-offs. And I think we have to face the reality. And in this particular example I'm talking about, and my next meeting is really about oil palm in Indonesia maybe generates 3 million jobs. We don't have the figures. It could, I think, have very significant impacts for poverty reduction, or has had very significant impacts for poverty reduction. But we also know it's had very significant impacts in terms of deforestation in tropical forests, and that's why it gets into the front page of the New York Times sometimes. And I think if we had a way of putting values on that, we can put the values on the jobs and the incomes, but we often don't put a very good, put values, or very, very firm values at least, on some of the environmental services provided by forests. And forests, of course, provide economic services as well, but when we get into the environmental services, we talk about them, but we don't often value them. So I think from that point of view, choice modeling has a great deal of potential. And one of the things that I particularly like in the case studies and the approaches that are being used here, we don't just talk about forests, we talk about the attributes. And that's very important, I think, recognizing that for different stakeholders, different attributes can be, have different importance, different levels of importance. For example, in the case of forests, local people may put more emphasis on watershed services, on certain types of biodiversity related to medicinal plants and so on. At the global level, we put more emphasis on the orangutans, we put more emphasis on the greenhouse gases and so on. So different stakeholders will put different values on different types of attributes. The other thing I think is very important is the scale issue. And it's not just putting values on those attributes, but putting values at the margin, so you can still really trade off, what difference does another 10,000 orangutans make, rather than just saying, what value we put on orangutans per se. So I think both the attributes and the scale, bringing them into the choice model, I think that is very, very powerful. Okay, but I can't always just say good things up here. I need to raise a few questions about the methods as well. And let me just talk about a couple that struck me as I was thinking about this. One is, and it relates very much to the point I just made, is you've got a whole range of different stakeholders, and particularly when you get into environmental services, whole range of different stakeholders. They all have different values, all have different interests. And then how do you start to scale up and aggregate those values into some sort of a global picture? And I think most of the case studies here have been at the local level, and they're very good at getting at those local level values. But I think the real challenge now as we get into many of these environmental issues are global. How can we move from this sort of more local community level up to a global level in terms of putting values? I'd be interested to hear how the authors would respond to that. And then a second one, of course, when we do these types of choice models and hypothetical choices, even though we've certainly gone a long way in terms of practically how to do that, and I think that's really another one of the strengths of this set of case studies. There's a lot of practical information in there about how you could do this better in the future. And I think many of the authors have admitted, we learned a lot out of this process, and we've made adjustments, and we're really advancing in terms of the methodologies. But I think the question is, and within these sorts of choice models, how do we get a reality check in terms of what these values are? And I was thinking of going back to my original comments on risk and income trade-offs. We always had this question, well, what about the reality on the ground? And in the end, Hans Binswanger went out in India, and instead of asking people about to make choices, he actually played a game with them with real money and estimated those trade-offs. It turned out that I think his estimated trade-off for risk and incomes was quite similar to what we were getting from the hypothetical choices. But I think it does raise a question about what we could do in this case, and I realize you can't play real games with national parks and so on. But there are some interesting examples out there, and the one that just came to my mind as I was going through this is the government of Norway sitting down with the government of Indonesia and coming to some sort of a agreement that we will pay $1 billion if you will take one province and implement a pilot RED program, no deforestation in that province over the next 3 years. Okay, so there must have been some bargaining going on there between the government of Norway and the government of Indonesia to arrive at the $1 billion figure. And perhaps that gives us some idea of the types of values that may be involved. Another question I had in the choice experiments is, what are we doing in practice here? We're asking decision makers, various types of decision makers, to make choices, but we're also conveying a lot of information as part of that. And I think you note that in the presentation, that you had to explain very carefully to the decision makers about what some of these trade-offs were. You can do that at a sort of a smaller scale, but when you start scaling up, how do you get that information component into it? And I'm thinking also back to my oil palm example again. There's a big movement to certify oil palm so that it's certified to not knock down the forest in the last 5 years. But it turns out it's very difficult to get a premium in the market for that certification. And there could be various reasons for that. But one of the reasons, I think, is just information, lack of information. Many consumers do not associate the fact that they're consuming oil palm with the fact that they may be contributing to deforestation. So again, I think I'd be interested to hearing from you about what are the reality checks we can use in this case in terms of the types of values that we're estimating. Then a third question, of course, is so what? We do all this, we get some nice values. What impact does it have? Does it really change decisions in practice? And that brings us to a whole set of questions about the role of evidence-based decision-making and the evidence that we have that it can make a difference in terms of better decisions. I think IFPRI is in a good position to address that. And certainly IFPRI has a number of case studies out there where they've looked at the impact of their own policy research on policy decisions. And in fact, I think there's growing evidence, and even Maximo might want to even comment on this, but I think there's growing evidence that if you have evidence-based policy making from the analytical and empirical work that you're doing, it can have an impact on policy decisions. There's another nice example from Indonesia, from C4, where evidence-based evidence on the relationship between agricultural expansion and deforestation led to a change in the implementation of a policy. And that's been well documented, that in that case it was the evidence and getting out through civil society organizations in that case did lead to a definite change in both the private sector and the public sector in the implementation of existing policies. So I think it would be, I think we can have some faith that if we do this, it will make a difference. But I think one of the challenges then, and perhaps even for some of these case studies, would be to follow up. How do we get this onto the agenda of decision makers that could use this information, and then follow up and see what sort of impact it's really had on the decision, on the actual decisions. Which then leads me to my final point, that all of these case studies, I think, are related to ex-ante decisions, that the possibility of being able to do something based on this evidence. But you can use choice modeling in more of an ex-post sense. And in fact, we're working with Jeff and others in the CGIR right now in terms of evaluating the ex-post impacts of environmental impacts of agricultural research. And as part of that, several of the case studies, I think about 3 of them, are using choice modeling approaches to be able to put values on the environmental services provided or in some cases, the environmental services that may be taken away as part of the agricultural research intervention. I think it's showing many of the same outcomes as we're getting with these case studies. It's not easy to do in practice in many cases. It has to be very much adjusted to local context. And certainly even in a country like Peru, as you go from communities that have relatively high levels of literacy, well integrated into the market, go to a much more isolated community, I think it's been proven much more difficult to apply some of these practices on the ground. I know you're from Peru, but Jeff can tell you about one of the communities that's way up in the Andes, and you have to ride a horse to get there. Carry your choice model decision tool kit with you. But I think that even in that context, they've been able to simplify and being able to come up with some values for, in this case, genetic diversity and genetic resources.